What's going on, everybody? This is Andre here, filling in for Kevin, and in this video, I'm going to be giving you my full review of the Umidigi G3 Max. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, the Umidigi G3 Max is a really affordable budget offering from Umidigi, and for what it is, I do think this phone has a lot to offer. For the display, we're getting a pretty large 6.6-inch LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 400, and a 20.06:9 aspect ratio. So overall, in pretty much every way, this is a really good display. Now, one thing I do want to point out here is that if you're looking at this phone on Umidigi's website, it might look like it has a 120Hz refresh rate, but unfortunately that's not entirely accurate. As you can see here, the actual refresh rate is only 60Hz, which, to be fair, when you're scrolling around the display and stuff like that, it does still feel decently nice. But if you do get this phone expecting an actual 120Hz refresh rate, you may be disappointed here. Keep in mind, when they say it has a 120Hz display, what they're actually referring to is not the refresh rate, but the sample rate instead. And basically what this means is, compared to your average normal 60Hz display, the screen is going to be a little bit more sensitive. And while this isn't going to make the movement on the screen faster and smoother and more premium like a normal 120Hz refresh rate, it will at least be a bit more responsive. So if you're maybe playing a game, for example, it will have a bit of an advantage. But aside from this, in pretty much every other way, I am actually pretty happy with the display we're getting here. With the 1080p resolution, things are going to be nice and sharp and crisp. So if you're doing stuff like watching videos, for example, or maybe playing a game where the image quality is a bit more important, things are going to look real nice here. Despite having an LCD and not like an AMOLED or an OLED, the colors still look nice. The display in general is decently bright, and at 6.6 inches, the display is pretty large here too. And honestly, in this price range, getting a 1080p resolution, while not being exactly rare per se, is definitely quite a bit less common. I want to say most entry-level phones at this point in 2023 usually have 720p instead. So in general, if you're consuming a lot of content, and you want to make sure your phone has a nice display, then this phone will be a good choice for you. The only real drawback I see here is that with an LCD display, the viewing angles are maybe not the best. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, or really in any kind of bright area, compared to something like an AMOLED or an OLED, this display may be a bit more difficult to see. But again, aside from that, I do think we are getting a really good display here. For storage, with the Umidigi G3 Max, we're getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so definitely plenty of storage here. For the average user, you're most likely not going to ever fill this up. And even if you do come close, maybe you're someone who's constantly downloading apps and games and stuff like that. Again, this phone does support microSD card expansion, so you can always offload your photos and videos, and this definitely will save you some space. For an entry-level phone, I do think having 128GB is definitely impressive, especially considering in this same kind of price range, I have seen phones even in 2023 with as little as 32. So overall, if storage is important to you, you definitely won't go wrong with this phone. For security features, with the Umidigi G3 Max, this phone does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key, so definitely a great spot for a fingerprint scanner. But real quick, let's give it a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive. No issues at all. And again, remember, this phone does have Face Unlock too, so I definitely appreciate getting multiple options besides a pin to unlock it. For the camera setup, with the Umidigi G3 Max, up front, we got a water drop notch designed for the selfie camera. Overall, in the general context of the phone, it does look decently nice. I would have preferred a hole punch, but for an entry-level phone, it is to be expected. Now this camera is 8 megapixels, and then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. Now I was honestly kind of disappointed seeing that this phone doesn't even have a macro camera, let alone an ultra wide camera, because at this point in 2023, both of those features are really useful, and even in this price range, they are pretty common too. But to be fair, especially with the ultra wide camera, it's really not an expectation in this price range, so seeing that we're at least getting a really high quality 50 megapixel main camera is definitely nice. And speaking of which, to give you an idea of what it can do, here's a few pictures taken with the Umidigi G3 Max. So in general, I do think the photo quality here is pretty good for what it is. Sure, if you're coming from maybe a higher end device and you have higher expectations, or you're really just going to be using your camera a lot in general, then yeah, you're probably going to want to spend a bit more and get something higher end with a better camera. But for a more casual camera user for more everyday normal use, I do think it will get the job done. I mean, if you're trying to take the occasional decent Instagram photo every now and then, for something like social media, you really don't need an insanely nice camera. I mean, those platforms compress images anyway, so overall, if you compare a photo taken by this phone to something a bit higher end, it's probably not going to make an insane difference, so the bottom line is, for that type of use, it will get the job done. But at the same time, if taking photos is really one of your main things you're doing with your phone, then again, in that case, you can most likely justify spending a bit more and getting something higher end. But in general, if you are looking for a more affordable phone that still has a decent camera, I do think this phone will get the job done. Also keep in mind for video, with this phone, we are getting a max recording quality of 1080p in the rear camera and 720p in the front. And the video quality, while not being terrible, is definitely not ideal if you're really recording lots of videos, especially with the selfie camera. So if that is something you're doing a lot of, definitely keep this in mind. Here's a quick test video with the Umidigi G3 Max. We are recording in 1080p right now. Also keep in mind what the audio sounds like. So as you could see there, definitely not the greatest quality, but if you're really just using this phone for maybe Snapchat for example, where the quality is really not that important, or just sending a video to friends and family, something more low impact, where you really don't need the absolute best quality, but you just need it to be at least decent, then in that case, this phone will get the job done. But again, if video quality is really important to you, I would probably get something else. For the RAM and processor, with the Umidigi G3 Max, we're getting 8GB of RAM with the Unisoc T606 processor. Now, first of all, keep in mind, this phone does not have 5G connectivity, so if that is important to you, you will want to get something else. And at this point in 2023, on one hand, 5G is still not absolutely necessary, but on the other hand, it definitely is the future. So of course, if you want access to your carrier's latest and greatest network, you might want to consider getting a 5G phone instead, especially because 5G is definitely becoming more and more important, and if you really want to future-proof things, you will want to get a 5G phone. But again, it's still not absolutely necessary, so if you're really just looking for a basic, affordable phone, a 4G phone like this is still perfectly fine. When it comes to overall performance, this phone is definitely not super slow, and compared to your average entry-level phone, it is actually a bit on the faster side. That being said though, if you're really going to be on your phone a lot, especially doing more demanding activities, you might want to consider spending a bit more and getting something higher end that's just faster, because while it's still perfectly fine for more light to moderate use and more basic activities like occasional web browsing, light social media use, streaming content like videos and music, and even a tiny bit of mobile gaming, if you are really going to be on it a lot, the performance can get a bit sluggish. So overall, if the performance is really a priority for you, you might want to get something else. Now I ran a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone will be a performance upgrade for you. Because depending on what you're coming from, it may or may not be. If you're coming from maybe an older flagship phone, for example, that's on one hand older, but on the other hand still pretty high end, then I feel like this is going to be a pretty big downgrade. But if you're coming from maybe a lower end device, then chances are this phone could be a pretty solid upgrade. But again, in general, if you're really looking for a phone for more basic activities and more casual, moderate use, you will most likely be satisfied with the performance here. But if you are really looking for something fast, then you might want to get something a bit higher end instead. Now for the battery, the Umidigi G3 Max does have a 5150 mAh battery, so definitely a really large battery here. So if you're looking for something that's going to last all day without having to charge it, maybe you're just really not around a charger a whole lot, but you still have to use your phone heavily. In that kind of situation, this phone will be a great choice because, in my experience, the battery life is really good. And then down the road, as the battery degrades, which all batteries do, as this phone's battery wears out compared to a much smaller battery, you're not really going to notice it nearly as quickly. And since this phone has a lot more battery life than you really need per charge, it's going to take a lot longer before you actually have to replace it. So if you are looking for a phone you can keep for a longer amount of time without having to replace, this phone will be great for that too. But also keep in mind, with this phone, there is no wireless charging. Now, on one hand, I didn't really expect it in a phone like this, but on the other hand, if your current phone has it, and you're expecting most phones in 2023 to actually have that feature, which to be fair is a pretty reasonable assumption, wireless charging isn't really that crazy in my opinion, and it's been around for a while. But still, just keep in mind, so far in 2023, pretty much every phone that has wireless charging is going to be a bit higher end. There is a handful of lower end phones that do have it, but as a general rule of thumb, in a more entry level device like this, you're typically not going to get wireless charging. For the software, the Umidigi G3 Max does have Android 13, so definitely great to see there. But unfortunately, this phone does not have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, keep in mind you won't be able to do that here, so if that feature is important to you, you will want to get something else. Now, honestly at this point in 2023, despite this not being that surprising considering this is a really entry-level phone, I feel like really every smartphone should have NFC, because even though not everyone uses it, I want to say at least in the US, pretty much every store has some sort of tap and pay. So missing out on that feature because your phone doesn't have the technology for it is definitely disappointing, especially if maybe you don't currently use it, but maybe you end up wanting to try it in the future. So overall, if you do see yourself ever using tap and pay, you will probably want to get something else. But of course, again, not everyone really cares about that feature. So if you don't see yourself ever using it, then this probably won't be a big deal. Now, taking a look at the overall device itself, it does have a pretty nice looking design. Maybe not the most sleek and modern, it has a slightly thicker bottom bezel and the top too. And the water drop notch, again, I'm really not a huge fan, but as far as everything else goes, it does look pretty nice. And especially the back. I like the camera module, and this orange leathery kind of textured material is pretty cool too. As you can see, you really can't see any fingerprints, so definitely nice there. On the left side of the phone, we got the slot for the SIM card and the micro SD card. On the bottom, we got the microphone, USB-C port, and the speaker. On the right side, we got the power key, which is also the fingerprint scanner, volume down, volume up. On the top, we got the noise canceling microphone, 3.5mm headphone jack. And finally, on the back, we got, again, this pretty cool finish, camera module, flash, and Umidigi branding. Now, when it comes to the materials, keep in mind this phone is of course made entirely of plastic, except the display, which is glass. And while overall I expect pretty much every entry-level phone like this to be made entirely of plastic, I will say on this phone it feels a bit cheaper, so if you are hoping for something a bit more durable or even a bit more premium, you might be disappointed because in addition to feeling kind of cheap, there's really no weight here. So definitely not the most premium feeling device. And in addition to this, because of these materials, I definitely recommend pairing it up with some kind of case, which luckily with this phone, there is one included in the box. So in here, we do have this kind of thin case. Now, if you are in a situation where maybe you work outside, for example, and your phone is going to be a bit more exposed to the elements, or maybe you're a bit more prone to dropping it, then I do recommend getting something a little bit stronger than this, just because despite definitely being decent for more casual daily use, since after all no one really plans on dropping their phone, right? Again, it is a little bit thin, so if you drop your phone on concrete or something, with the phone's materials combined with a case like this, it might not do too well. So definitely keep this in mind. But again, at least it does come with a case, which most phones nowadays don't. So I am happy about that. In addition to this, the phone also does come with a screen protector, which you can kind of see here, but the fact that it's barely noticeable is honestly a really good thing because, of course, if you have a screen protector on, you don't want it to be noticeable. So with this phone, it's nice because not only do we get it, giving the screen a bit more protection, but it also doesn't get in the way or anything. So definitely a net benefit here. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Umidigi G3 Max. Overall, on one hand, if you get this phone expecting a lot, you could definitely be disappointed. Again, there's no 5G connectivity, no real extra features like wireless charging or NFC. The camera, despite being decent photo quality wise, is relatively featureless. The video recording is pretty disappointing, and the performance, while not being terrible, is again a bit sluggish at times. So yeah, is it really the best phone out there? Definitely not, but at the same time, for the money, I feel like it does have quite a bit to offer. Probably my favorite thing about this phone is the display. Again, we are getting a really nice 1080p display here, and at 6.6 inches, it is pretty large too. So if you're consuming a lot of content and that's really one of the main things you're doing with your phone, maybe for example, it could be like a phone you give to a kid to watch videos, or maybe you're someone who watches a lot of videos yourself, or maybe you're playing games, something like that. If you're really consuming content on this phone, for what it is, I do think it will give you a great experience. And again, it also has plenty of storage, the latest version of Android, great battery life and longevity. And again, despite the camera not having a bunch of features, the actual photo quality itself for what it is pretty good. So if you're really not concerned about taking ultra wide photos or using a macro camera, but you want to get some decent regular photos for something like Instagram, for example, I do think this phone will get the job done for that. So if you are looking for a really affordable phone for more basic activities, and you want to make sure you get a good amount of value for the money, then I would say this phone is definitely worth considering. But this concludes my review of the Umidigi G3 Max. Keep in mind, if you want to learn more about this phone's pricing and availability, definitely check out the link in the video description, because this information does change from time to time. But again, this is Andre here. This was the Umidigi G3 Max, and I will see you in the next video.